Hey there, this is Alexis Knight. Welcome to True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. I am your host, guiding you through cases that have moved through the courts and reached a conclusion, but left the public divided. These are not your typical cut and dried cases. These are the ones where the facts may be clear, but the truth? Well, that's another story. Today, we delve into the life of Robert Durst, a man you probably have heard of. A man born into immense wealth who, under the influence of his own perceived power, became entangled in a series of criminal investigations. Durst's story is a complex web of privilege, alleged crimes, and legal battles that have captivated the public for decades. And now imagine this. You're a successful real estate heir, living a life of luxury and influence. But beneath the surface, dark secrets and unresolved suspicions begin to unravel. Your wife disappears under mysterious circumstances. A close confidant is found murdered, and a neighbor's dismembered body is discovered. What would drive someone with everything to lose to risk it all? In this episode, we're going to explore the controversial life of Robert Durst, examining the events that led to his downfall and the public's divided opinion on his guilt and innocence. Was he a victim of circumstance, or did his wealth and power enable a series of heinous acts? Stick with me here to find out more about this case that left many people asking, how far can privilege shield one from justice? Because of their nature, these cases are difficult to decide, leaving people at odds with each other. The court has made its ruling, but what do you think? Today, we will dive into a case that has sparked endless debate, so listen closely, and by the end of the episode, you'll have the chance to decide for yourself. Was justice truly served, or is there more to the story? All right, Robert Durst, born into the influential Durst family, was poised to inherit a vast real estate empire. Despite his privileged upbringing, Durst's life was marred by a series of troubling events that would eventually lead to multiple criminal investigations. In 1982, Durst's first wife, Kathleen McCormack Durst, disappeared without a trace. Despite extensive searches and investigations, her body was never found, and the case remains unsolved. Durst was suspected, but never charged in connection with her disappearance. Then, in 2000, Susan Berman, a close friend of Durst and the daughter of a Las Vegas mobster, was found murdered execution-style in her Los Angeles home. Berman had been Durst's spokesperson during the investigation into Kathleen's disappearance, leading to speculation about her knowledge of the case. Durst was again considered a suspect, but managed to evade charges for years. In 2001, while living in Galveston, Texas, Durst was arrested for the murder and dismemberment of his neighbor, Morris Black. Durst admitted to killing Black, but claimed it was in self-defense. And in a surprising verdict, he was acquitted of murder, though he did serve time for evidence tampering and bail jumping. And then Durst's life took another turn when he agreed to participate in a documentary series titled The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. That is streaming. I don't know if it's streaming right now, but it often is, so look for that. During the filming, Durst was caught on a hot microphone, seemingly confessing to the murder, saying, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." This apparent confession led to renewed investigations and ultimately his arrest in 2015. Now, in 2021, Durst was tried and convicted for the murder of Susan Berman, receiving a life sentence without any possibility of parole. And shortly after his sentencing, Durst was charged with the murder of his first wife, Kathleen, though he passed away in January of 2022 before he could stand trial. Durst's case raises profound questions about the influence of wealth and privilege in the criminal justice system. Did his status enable him to evade justice? For so long, Or was he a man haunted by circumstances beyond his control? As we delve deeper into this case, consider where the line lies between self-defense and premeditated murder, and how societal status can blur that line. Robert Durst's life has always been under the spotlight, but it wasn't until a series of disturbing events unfolded that the public began to see him as more than just a wealthy real estate heir. Born into the influential Durst family, he was expected to take over the family's billion-dollar empire. But from a young age, his life was marked by tragedy and estrangement. At just 7 years old, Robert witnessed his mother's death in what was reported as a suicide. This traumatic event would later be cited by those who analyzed his erratic behavior as a pivotal moment in his life. By the 70s, Robert had married Kathleen McCormack, a bright and ambitious medical student. However, their relationship was far from idyllic. Friends described Robert as controlling and Kathleen as increasingly desperate to leave the marriage. In January of 1982, Kathleen disappeared after reportedly meeting with Robert at their South Salem, New York home. Her family was devastated, and despite their pleas for answers, her body was never found. Investigators suspected foul play, but with no hard evidence tying Robert to her disappearance, the case went cold for decades. Kathleen's family would later accuse Robert of using his wealth and influence to derail the investigation. In the early 2000s, the cold case of Kathleen's disappearance regained public attention, but it was a second, chilling crime that truly put Robert Durst back in the spotlight. Susan Berman, a longtime friend and confidant of Robert, was found murdered in her LA home in December of 2000. Berman had served as Robert's unofficial spokesperson during Kathleen's disappearance, defending him in the press and managing public scrutiny. Authorities believed she may have known too much, possibly even helping Robert cover up Kathleen's disappearance. Her execution-style murder raised suspicions, but once again, Robert evaded charges due to a lack of evidence. Then, just a year later, in 2001, Robert found himself at the center of yet another shocking case. This time, the crime took place in Galveston, Texas, where Robert had been living in disguise as a mute woman. His neighbor, Morris Black, was found dismembered, with his body parts discovered in garbage bags floating in Galveston Bay. Robert admitted to killing Black, but claimed it was in self-defense after a struggle over a gun. Incredibly, despite the gruesome nature of the crime, a jury acquitted Robert of murder, accepting his self-defense argument. He did, however, serve time for evidence tampering and the bail jumping. The twist in Robert Durst's story didn't end there. In 2010, filmmaker Andrew Jarecki approached Robert to participate in a documentary series titled The Jinx, The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst. So what began as a cinematic exploration of his life, it turned into an investigative triumph. Over the course of filming, new evidence came to light, and Robert's candid interviews provided chilling insights into his psyche. The climax of the series came when Robert, unaware his microphone was still recording, muttered to himself in a restroom, "What the hell did I do?" Killed them all, of course. Well, this apparent confession sent shockwaves through the public and reignited calls for justice. And in 2015, armed with this new evidence, authorities charged Robert with the murder of Susan Berman. The trial, delayed for years due to legal maneuvering and the COVID-19 pandemic, finally took place in 2021. Prosecutors painted a damning picture of Robert as a manipulative and dangerous man who used his wealth to stay above the law. The jury agreed, convicting him of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Shortly after his sentencing, Robert was then charged with Kathleen's murder as well. But then, as I stated, he passes away in early 2022 before facing trial. The prosecution's case against Robert Durst, It focused on a chilling narrative of calculated violence and manipulation, tying together decades of suspicion. Prosecutors argued that Susan Berman's murder was not an isolated incident, but a deliberate act to silence a key witness who could have implicated Robert in the disappearance of Kathleen McCormack Durst. They leaned heavily on Susan's closeness to Robert and her role in shielding him during the original investigation into Kathleen's disappearance. And to strengthen their case, prosecutors pointed to the timing of Susan's murder. Shortly after Robert learned that law enforcement had reopened Kathleen's case, evidence showed that Robert had wired Susan $50,000 shortly before her death, which the prosecution framed as a payoff to secure her silence. When this wasn't enough, they argued, Robert eliminated her to protect himself. A pivotal piece of evidence came from that movie, the documentary The Jinx, the series that had reignited public interest in the case, because during filming is when he leaked on a hot mic, "What the hell did I do? Killed them all, of course." Now, prosecutors used this recording as the centerpiece of their argument, claiming it was a confession that spanned not only Susan's murder, but Kathleen's disappearance and Morris Black's killing. The prosecution painted Robert as a manipulative man who used his wealth and privilege to avoid accountability for years. They emphasized his ability to hire top-tier defense attorneys, stall legal proceedings, and outmaneuver investigators at every turn. And to further sway the jury, they brought in forensic evidence, expert testimony, and witnesses who corroborated the timeline of events leading to Susan's death. Their strategy was clear: show that Robert had a pattern of violent behavior and that Susan's murder was a calculated step in covering his tracks. The defense countered the prosecution's case with a narrative that portrayed Robert Durst as a victim of circumstance and media sensationalism. They argued that the state's reliance on circumstantial evidence made their case weak and speculative. One of their primary strategies was to discredit the now infamous hot mic recording from The Jinx. The defense claimed that Robert's comments were incoherent musings taken out of context, arguing that they were not a confession. They were the ramblings of a man under immense stress. Robert's legal team also highlighted the lack of direct evidence tying him to Susan Berman's murder. They pointed out that no physical evidence, such as fingerprints, DNA, or eyewitness testimony, linked him to the crime scene. The prosecution's case, they argued, was built entirely on speculation and circumstantial connections. The defense also aimed to humanize Robert, portraying him as a frail, elderly man suffering from numerous health issues. They argued that his declining physical and mental state made it implausible for him to commit such a calculated crime. This portrayal was designed to evoke sympathy from the jury and to cast doubt on the idea that Robert was capable of orchestrating Susan's murder. Furthermore, the defense questioned the motivations of key witnesses, suggesting that some may have been influenced by the media attention surrounding The Jinx. They argued that the documentary series blurred the lines between entertainment and truth, potentially biasing not only the public, but also the legal proceedings. The trial of Robert Durst unfolded under intense media scrutiny, with public opinion sharply divided. On one hand, many viewed the case as a long overdue reckoning for a man who had evaded justice for decades. They saw Robert as the epitome of privilege, a wealthy heir who used his resources to manipulate the legal system. The fact that he had walked away from the Morris Black case with an acquittal only fueled outrage, with critics pointing to it as a glaring example of how wealth can influence justice. However, others sympathized with Robert, arguing that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on the court of public opinion. They questioned whether The Jinx had crossed ethical boundaries by presenting a one-sided narrative that painted Robert as guilty before he even stood trial. The series' dramatic presentation and the use of the hot mic recording were seen by some as manipulative tactics designed to sway viewers rather than present an unbiased account. Social media added another layer to the controversy, with debates raging on platforms like Twitter and Facebook. True crime enthusiasts dissected every detail of the case, from courtroom testimony to Robert's demeanor during the trial. Hashtags like Durst trial and the Jinx confession trended regularly, amplifying both support for and criticism of the prosecution. The case raised broader questions about that intersection of wealth and privilege and the criminal justice system. For decades, Robert Durst had managed to avoid serious consequences despite being connected to 3 deaths under suspicious circumstances. Critics argued that his financial resources allowed him to hire the best legal representation, exploit procedural loopholes, and effectively delay justice. The Galveston case in particular became a focal point for these debates. Robert's acquittal in the Morris Black murder trial, despite the gruesome nature of the crime, was cited as evidence of how privilege can skew the scales of justice. The fact that he admitted to dismembering Morris Black, but then walked free from murder charges, left many questioning whether an ordinary person would have received the same leniency. What do you think? Even with his eventual conviction in Susan Berman's case, some felt that justice had come too late. By the time Robert was sentenced to life in prison, he was in his late 70s, and he was in poor health, leaving little time for him to face the full consequences of his actions. Others, however, saw the conviction as a symbolic victory, a message that even the wealthy and powerful cannot escape accountability forever. And let's talk about that, because Robert Durst did get away with all of this, assuming he is guilty, for a very long time. The justice gap here. How did he avoid consequences? Really? Well, one of the most perplexing aspects of Robert Durst's story is how little physical evidence connected him to these crimes, despite the glaring suspicion that followed him for decades. From Kathleen McCormack Durst's disappearance in '82 to Susan Berman's murder in 2000, investigators really struggled to build solid cases. Advances in forensic science came a little too late to play a significant role in Kathleen's case, and the evidence in Susan's murder was largely circumstantial. Even in the Galveston case, where he admitted to dismembering Morris Black, no evidence definitively proved premeditation or intent to kill. This lack of evidence, coupled with Durst's ability to fund top-tier legal defenses, created an uphill battle for prosecutors. Legal experts have pointed out that cases like his highlight a critical flaw in the justice system. Without physical evidence, even the most compelling narratives can completely fall apart in court. Robert Durst's alleged crimes occurred in multiple states as well. This caused problems. He was in New York, California, and Texas, each with its own legal systems, judges, and law enforcement priorities. This geographical spread complicated efforts to prosecute this guy. Kathleen's disappearance in New York, for example, was initially treated as a missing persons case rather than a potential homicide, and this slowed investigative efforts. Susan Berman's murder in California, that came years later, during a time when cold case investigations were gaining more attention. But her ties to Robert were only uncovered through indirect evidence. By the time investigators connected the dots, many witnesses had passed away, and physical evidence had degraded. And then in Texas, where Durst faced trial for Morris Black's killing, the state's self-defense laws worked in his favor. And if you've heard many of my self-defense or murder cases, this is not an easy thing to do, to actually get self-defense laws on your side. Well, his legal team leveraged the state's lenient requirements for proving self-defense, and they convinced the jury that Robert acted out of fear rather than intent. These differences in state laws, combined with varying levels of resources and expertise in law enforcement, it created opportunities for Durst to exploit the system. His ability to adapt to each jurisdiction's weaknesses showed a level of cunning that few defendants possess. The timeline of Robert Durst's alleged crimes also spans 4 decades. That can complicate things also. This is a period during which the American legal system underwent significant changes. If not for the time, a lot went on. In the early 80s, when Kathleen disappeared, the criminal justice system relied heavily on eyewitness testimony and circumstantial evidence. DNA analysis, now a cornerstone of modern investigation, that was all still in its infancy. Had Kathleen's case occurred in the 2000s, forensic advances might have provided that smoking gun needed to charge Durst. By the time Susan Berman was murdered in 2000, cold case units were becoming more common, and the use of forensic technology had expanded. However, the evidence in her case still fell short of the standards needed for a swift conviction. It wasn't until 2015, with the emergence of new leads from that documentary series The Jinx, that authorities had enough momentum to formally charge Durst. Durst's access to wealth, it allowed him to hire the best legal teams, which also helped him evade justice. His defense team skillfully dismantled the prosecution's argument, turning what seemed like an open and shut case of murder into an acquittal. The jury's decision to believe Durst's claim of self-defense shocked many, particularly given the grisly nature of Morris Black's dismemberment. Wealth also played a role in shaping public perception in all of this. Durst's attorneys capitalized on media portrayals of him as an eccentric rather than dangerous, framing him as a misunderstood man rather than a calculated killer. This strategy not only influenced jurors, but also complicated efforts to secure indictments in other jurisdictions. Robert Durst's story is as much about the failures of justice, the failures of the justice system, as it is about his crimes. His ability to evade accountability for decades underscores the importance of closing legal loopholes that allow defendants with significant resources to game the system. His case also highlights the need for greater consistency in how states handle high-profile crimes, particularly those involving suspects with access to wealth and power. As we look back on Durst's journey through the courts, we're left with questions that resonate far beyond his story. How can the justice system ensure fairness when resources are so unevenly distributed? What safeguards can be put in place to prevent the kind of delays and manipulations that defined his legal battles? And let's take a look at some of what does define legal battles, depending on who you are and where you are. Examining the disparities in legal outcomes between defendants represented by private attorneys and, say, those with public defenders. It reveals significant insights into the criminal justice system, a bigger picture. While comprehensive, up-to-date stats comparing, say, New York and California are limited, existing data highlights notable trends. So, a 2000 study, year 2000, indicated that conviction rates varied across states. So approximately 82% in California and 72% in New York. These figures suggest that defendants in California faced a higher likelihood of conviction compared to those in New York during the same time period. Now, regarding the type of legal representation, data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics showed that in federal courts, 88% of felony defendants with publicly financed attorneys were convicted, compared to 77% with private lawyers. And this suggests that defendants with private attorneys do have a slightly lower conviction rate. Is this fair? Sentencing disparities also emerge based on representation. In federal courts, 88% of felony defendants with publicly financed attorneys received prison sentences, whereas the 77% with private lawyers were incarcerated. This indicates that those with private attorneys not only had lower conviction rates, but also faced incarceration less frequently. I mean, these are stats a lot of people do not know. Resource allocation between public defenders and private attorneys further influences case outcomes. Public defenders typically handle large caseloads with limited resources, potentially affecting the quality of defense they can provide. In contrast, private attorneys may have more time and resources to dedicate to individual cases, potentially leading to more favorable outcomes for their clients. While the data presents a complex picture, it underscores that the type of legal representation, public defender versus private attorney, can influence conviction rates and sentencing outcomes. Factors such as resource availability, attorney experience, and systemic disparities play critical roles in shaping these legal outcomes. If we pulled the stats today, would things be better? Worse? Have we created any change at all? Robert Durst's journey through the criminal justice system over time serves as a stark reminder of the complexities and challenges inherent in seeking justice. His ability to evade accountability for decades highlights critical disparities in how the system handles individuals with significant wealth and influence compared to those without such resources. In states like California and New York, legal outcomes can vary widely depending on the availability of evidence, the quality of representation, and the resources of the defendant. Wealthy individuals like Durst often have access to top-tier legal teams, allowing them to exploit procedural loopholes and delay proceedings. Meanwhile, defendants relying on public defenders face an uphill battle, often contending with overburdened attorneys and limited resources. This disparity underscores the need for systemic reforms to ensure equal access to justice, regardless of financial means. Ultimately, Durst's conviction in Susan Berman's murder provided some measure of accountability, though it came far too late for the victims and their families. His case has left a lasting impact on public perceptions of privilege in the justice system, raising important questions about how wealth, and power, and legal strategy intersect to shape outcomes. Thank you for joining me in True Crime, the Court of Public Opinion. Stay safe out there, ask the difficult questions, and always dig for the truth. Until next time, this is Alexis Knight.